So, this story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my very good friend. Let's call him Dan. Dan is a 5 feet 10 male from Maryland. He has a very strange sense of humor, and he's very smart, but an all-around good guy. Anyway, we go to the same university. I'm going to tell this story as best I remember it, so bear with me. Dan moved into his dorm room before his roommate did our freshman year. Dan had everything all moved in and settled, and just as he sat down, his roommate showed up to move everything in. His roommate, we'll call him Brian, introduced himself and his mother and father who were helping him move, much like any other person. Dan decided to help his new roommate move everything in since he didn't know anyone yet, as he was from a different state. So Dan and Brian's family get down to their car as Brian stayed behind in the room to put things away. This is the first red flag in this story. As they opened the trunk, Brian's father looked at Dan directly in the face and said, "Good luck." Dan, thinking he meant with classes, said thanks and grabbed a box. Boy, was he wrong. Dan carried that box upstairs and into the room where Brian proceeded to flip out. He screamed about how that box had his special ingredients for a project he was doing, and Dan probably broke it. Weird, but everyone has their quirks. They finished moving Brian in, and his parents said goodbye, and again, Brian's dad told Dan good luck, which is really weird. But anyway, a couple of guys came by the door to ask if they wanted to go eat, and Dan said sure, but Brian stayed behind to finish unpacking his stuff. While Dan was eating, he got a call from Brian asking if he would mind if he smoked weed in the room. Dan, being that he wants to work for the CDC, said absolutely not. Brian screamed something unintelligible and hung up the phone. He called him back a few minutes later and asked if he could smoke weed in the closet. Again, Dan said no. Brian hung up without a word, and Dan and his friends decided to go make sure he wasn't actually smoking weed in the room. When they got there, they found him in the closet eating the weed. Weird as hell, right? Not even close to as bad as this will get. At night, Brian would wake Dan up by standing beside his bed, then ask him one question. Dan would answer, and Brian would walk back to his bed and go to sleep. This happened every night for a week. At this point, Brian had moved in an entire toolbox full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, and an assortment of power tools, things that weren't needed in a dorm room. During this entire week, Brian never left the room. The only time he left was to eat and go to the bathroom, thankfully. About 4 days before the week when dorm room changes could be made, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him how he felt about gay people. Dan said he didn't really care what anyone did, and it was fine with him. Dan woke up the next morning with Brian sitting in a chair directly by his head, staring at him. Dan instinctively yelled, "What the fuck are you doing?" Brian replied, "I'm starting to have feelings for you. You need to move out. I don't want you getting hurt during what is coming." After that, Dan left and didn't sleep in his room for a couple of days until he could move. Unfortunately, there were no open rooms, so he couldn't move. During this time, Brian started to follow Dan around. Brian would sleep in the closet with his tools, making something. Dan eventually convinced the head of the dorm to let him move into the now empty room next door after 3 weeks in what he describes as hell. Dan moves to the room next door. No big deal, right? Wrong. 2 days later, Dan gets a knock on the door at 9 a.m. Thinking it was the guys on his floor that he had become friends with, fucking with him, he screams, "What the fuck do you want?" and answers the door in his boxers. At the door were 4 state police troopers in full hazmat gear. The trooper in front said, "Not who you were expecting, huh?" So at least someone had a sense of humor. They let Dan put some clothes on, then led him out the door. At the end of the hallway was Brian, in handcuffs. Turns out, Brian had been building pipe bombs and other bombs in the dorm room while Dan was at class. After Dan had moved out, he took over the other bed and closet for his bomb-making activities. The reason the hazmat team was there was that Brian had spilled liquid mercury all over. So, I moved to NYC last May and got a room in a 4-bedroom in Harlem. My 4 roommates were all either aspiring actors or models. and all of them came straight from Paris. One night, it was 3 a.m., and I was woken up by the sound of someone loudly sobbing outside my door. I decided to mind my business. But then there was banging on my door and the voice of one of the models, Clarice, screaming for help. I opened the door and she was standing there in her underwear, sobbing, and I asked her what was wrong, but she barely spoke English. She said, "I'm blind. Please God, help me. I'm blind." It was 3 a.m., so I was very confused, and I had spoken to her only a few times in passing. I told her it was going to be okay and went to our freezer to get ice for her because in my half-awake mind, I decided that holding ice on her blinded eyes would fix the issue. I had forgotten that our fridge broke and all of us were too lazy to take the meat out of the freezer. We had adopted a just don't open it policy when it came to the freezer. So I opened it and there was just an insane amount of rotting meat and I was gagging and Clarice was crying so loudly. I told her to wait there while I went outside to get eye drops from across the street. I gave her the eye drops and a cold bottle of water I got, and she asked me to help her put the eye drops in because she was shaking and afraid. So I held this girl's sweaty-ass eyelids open while she was cursing in French in her underwear, and I dropped the eye drops in and gave her a banana to eat, and literally tucked her in because I assumed that would help. And at this point, the whole apartment smelled like rotting meat. Apparently, a photographer had told her that a lip gloss nail polish cocktail looked great as eyeliner, so she did a photo shoot with that on her eyes. She came home to try to wash it out and it all went into her eyes. Everything I did not help, and she later just went to a hospital after I went back to bed. This story is quite popular within my family and among most of my friends. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend. At the time of this story, she was looking for her first apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together since they had only dated for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like, "Roommate Wanted, Females Only." This sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most places listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable with living with any males. The other roommate would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she received an email back with all the details and a time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by at 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there is a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice, but slightly unkempt. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda, though. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opens the door. At first, Amanda thinks she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant, I forget the name, was out and he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off, but aren't at red alert yet. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walk around the house, Amanda notices one huge red flag. No furniture, nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keeping lights on for too long, rushing her around, and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walk down the hallway into the living room, she notices the front door has a plank nailed across it. Broken. For sure. Amanda's creepometer is starting to ding, so she decides to wrap up the walkthrough and leave, but tries to be polite. As she's giving the guy her thanks for the showing bit, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement. It's recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in the small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs, and says, "Ladies first." What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda gets a text just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey, yeah, are you here? I'll come out from around back and let you in. It's great. You have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out of the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprints to her car and speeds like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother and my brother everything. Cops were called, they took her statement, and went to investigate. The Craigslist post had been removed. Later on, the house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier, and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room the landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gallon jugs everywhere. More creepy was he had plastered ripped-up pages from porno mags on all the walls in the room. Where do they even find porno mags? The really scary part of this was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs about halfway down. The basement was empty except for another pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box with a few rolls of assorted tape.